while we grill our panel on their views on issues affecting and impacting the disability sector and how to approach interviewing. We will be looking at after, well, I think those two will tie in very well together. We touched on that in some of the questions. What is the best appropriate way to interview our subjects? And it was great to talk to a couple of the students in the break and hear how excited you are about your ideas. So let's hone that a bit more with some issues that perhaps you're not aware about. So if we go through our panel, firstly we have Mick Cherry, who is a self-advocate and who will be giving his perspective today. We've got John again, thank you for joining us again. Simon, thank you for joining us. It might even be best, he's the manager from Specialist Behaviour Service at Endeavour Foundation. Endeavour Foundation is one of our key partners and will be working with you on possible stories. Thank you. We've also got Paige Armstrong, who is the CEO of Queenslanders with a Disability Network. And Donna Best is involved with them, so there's a bit of a link there. Also, we have next to Paige, Leanne, is that right? Leanne from Senior Writer News Queensland, who has written some incredible stories on disability issues. We'll be finding out her perspective on how to do interviewing later. Jenny Froud from the Sporting Wheelies and Disabled Association. She's a Community Engagement and Education Manager. And we heard a little bit from Jeff Trappett before, the founder of Inclusion Moves, and we'll be hearing more now. And also we've got Leona from WILD, the fantastic group that works with people with an intellectual disability who have been victims of domestic violence. And it's a very important area there too. So firstly, issues impacting the disability sector. Simon, could we hear from you on what you see as these important issues are that perhaps are really flying under the radar for the media at the moment?
Yep, sure. Some are, some aren't, I guess. I guess I'd premise what I'd say is my area of interest and expertise, if I've got any, is around intellectual disability and concerning or problem behaviour. So on the one hand, I'm not particularly well positioned to talk for the disability as a sector as a whole. On the same token, intellectual disability represents about, 1 and a bit to 2 and a bit% of the Australian population. So I don't know what that works out to these days, about 600,000 people or thereabouts, of which about 10 or 20% will engage in behaviour at some point in time that could harm themselves or others. So whilst on the one hand I'm interested in a really small area of disability service provision, it's still 50, 60, 70, 80,000 people. Okay. Intellectual disability has sort of got a fancy definition, but there's a fundamental practical definition as well, and that's folk who, as a result of significant cognitive impairment, have real difficulty learning new stuff, problem solving the way you and I problem solve, and perhaps as a result negotiating the world around them. It's not surprising that if that's one of the difficulties that you experience in life, that you will at times knowingly or unknowingly transgress social boundaries. And sometimes that even extends to transgressing legal boundaries. So the effective support of these folk for both their own quality of life and for, the rest of the people around them who might be impacted is really sort of significant. Few, if any, academic programs, certainly undergraduate programs and postgraduate programs that I'm aware of, address in detail how clinicians might best meet the needs of people with intellectual disability. None that I'm aware of deliver the requisite level of graduate work around supporting people with intellectual disability and challenging behaviour. So we've got this big chunk of folk out there, 60, 70, 80, 90,000 people, and a whole clinical community that hasn't been trained effectively in terms of how to meet their needs. So that's sort of social policy issue number one, to my mind. The other one, which is a bit different but related, is the indefinite detention regimes that we have in some jurisdictions across Australia, and in particular Queensland, which is the area I've got most knowledge of. About 20 years ago, the academic literature identified that people with intellectual disability, as a result of cognitive impairment, are really vulnerable in the criminal justice system. And there was a cry for and a subsequent development of a range of diversionary judicial responses to this particular group of people. In some states, like Queensland, access to those diversionary options necessitates an indefinite sentence, and that's an option that is not reserved for the severity of the crime or the potential risk of recidivism. It's an option reserved simply for whether you have an intellectual disability or a mental illness. I was asked to give evidence at a Senate inquiry about indefinite detention a little while ago, and I was asked whether Australia was in breach of its obligations under the Convention of Rights for Persons with a Disability as a result of our indefinite detention regimes. And my answer was, because you've got to be careful when a senator asks you if you think that Australia's in breach of its international obligations, right? But my answer was this, I'm not sure I'm okay with the fact that a society would ever embrace indefinite detention, but I get that it might. I'm not okay with the fact that we would reserve that type of sentencing only for people with disability, and particularly only for people with particular types of disability. And I guess those two issues, to my mind, the delivery of high quality academic training for clinicians supporting these folk, and the way our indefinite detention regimes have ended up focusing in particular on people with intellectual disability and mental illness, I think is an issue for us to stay across.
It reminds me, thank you, Simon, of a couple of stories I've done, if I can be a little bit self-indulgent here, but also the Not Equal Before the Law report from the Human Rights Commission would be really good to refer to. I did an interview with Mr McEwen, who was kind enough to come here today, about that only a couple of months ago, and he said it's still the case that people with a disability are not equal before the law. It's a very rich topic for investigations, and you reminded me of an interview I did just last year, I think perhaps a couple of years ago, with the parents of an intellectually disabled woman who was about to go to jail because she kept stealing pretty cards, that she was obsessed with pretty cards. So she would steal them from newsagents and things, and she had no sense of the wrong in that, but it took an awful lot to stop her from being sent to jail for that. So there's a very rich area. Thank you for highlighting that, Simon, appreciate it. Paige, for you, Queenslanders Disability Network, what are some of the issues you think impacting the disability sector as well?
Wow, what a big question. So you've had some members from Queenslanders with Disability Network speak in the room today, and our organisation, just to give you an overview, is an organisation that represents all people with disability, so that we cover people that have physical, intellectual, sensory, psychosocial, you name it, disabilities, and only people who have a disability can be a member, so it's a member-driven organisation. If you're asking what our members are telling us about the big issues for them, the big issues for them are the rollout of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, and we've been speaking about that a bit today, but basically because it's the best show in town for another 45,000 people in this state to get some form of funded support that have never previously gotten any funded support because of the historical underfunding. And that's the support that people often need just simply to get out of bed, have a shower, have something to eat, get dressed, and actually get out of their house. So, and then to participate in the community in either paid jobs or contributing to the community by spending money that local businesses absolutely love because it generates more business. So for our members, The rollout of the National Disability Scheme, big thing. But the other thing that is just as important for them is the implementation of the National Disability Strategy. The strategy was introduced to complement the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The National Disability Strategy actually covers all of those other things that people with disability in Australia and in Queensland need those additional supports around. That strategy is so important because as good as the NDIS, National Disability Insurance Scheme is, in Queensland 90,000, someone said earlier today, but 90,000 people on average will get some funded support. There's over 360,000 people with disability in this state. So there's another great significant number of people with disability that want all of the ordinary things that most of us, or all of us I would say, in this room want. We all want some form of, people want affordable, accessible housing. They want affordable, accessible transport. They want to be able to actually get out of their house, get down the road, go to a shop. If you look at curbing and channeling around most of our local communities, even in urban areas, like even around this campus today, it's often impossible because of all the different heights and widths, etc. People also just want to be able to get the same access to medical care, to education opportunities, etc. So when they were talking about what needs to happen, when the Australian governments, all the state and territory governments were talking with the federal government about what needs to happen, the big show in town wasn't just this thing called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, it was a thing called the National Disability Strategy that has been enacted and covers how those things should happen, how we get affordable, accessible transport so people can get out and about, how we get affordable, accessible accommodation so that those people that actually need something that is accessible, that is affordable for people on very low incomes that have additional issues because it costs them $1,000 a week in their power bill because of all the powerised equipment that they need in order to be able to get out and about, that the National Disability Strategy was a way of making sure that transport, that health, that everything else was also delivered in a way that's accessible to all Australians. So for whether it's at a Queensland level or a national level, if you're asking what our members are telling us, they're telling us that one thing is about the NDIS, but the other thing is people want accessible, affordable housing, they want accessible, affordable transport, and as part of doing all of those things, if you're journalism students, what I can't stress enough is what we know is that the individual story actually leads to that kind of systems advocacy. It's the individual stories of many people and the commonalities amongst those stories that actually make the big changes when it comes to how do you actually make those things happen. So from a Queensland perspective, if there's anything else I'd add, and I'll put a plug in, if anyone wants to do a story about mobile phone contract rip-offs, IT rip-offs, or short-term lending loan leases for people with disability in particular, we'd love to talk to you, because beside all the other things that you've heard about in the room today, I can tell you they're some of the great injustices that are currently taking place every time a person with intellectual, cognitive disability, mental health issue is conned into signing some of the new contracts that exist for especially those mobile phones. And voting, yes, Rob, I forgot the voting issue as well. Thank you.
So, Mick Cherry, thank you for your participation today. I think this is a good point to talk about with your role as a self-advocate and with Community Living Association. What are some of the issues that you'd like to see more covered in the media?
I reckon they should cover more mental illness in the media, because I've had a mental illness in the past where doctors have basically told me there was no problem, I don't have a mental illness, I basically don't even need to be on medication, I don't hear voices. And I think the government need to do something about it and to get the message out there to tell these people Just because we've got a disability, we don't mean we don't have a mental illness, because mental illness is a big important thing out there. People don't understand what it's about. People are getting, the police don't know what it's about. I mean, even the youth out there have got mental illness, and you know, they basically just get pushed away and get pushed aside because people just don't want to handle that kind of thing. And I think the media really need to actually talk to these people and say, hey, we hear about what these people are going through. What can we do to help those people with a mental illness and with a disability, and to get the message out there? Because, as I said, I went to a meeting with a couple of doctors a couple of years ago, and I tried to explain to them I had these voices in my head, and they wouldn't even let my worker in at the stage. They said, we don't want you in there, we just want to talk to Michael. And basically for me, it was really bad, because all they wanted to say over and over again, you don't have this mental illness, you don't have it, or you don't need to be on medication. And it's the same thing that's happening over and over again, and it frustrated me that I couldn't have my own worker in there to tell them that she experienced it, because I've told her how it is for me. I've been in and out of hospital a couple of times, you know. I can tell you that mental illness is a big thing, and for people who don't understand that they should it is a very hard thing for me. And I think for journalists, I think it's important to really get to talk to people with that mental illness and get it out there.
And how would be the best way to do that, do you think, Mick, to talk to some of the organisations that you're involved with and find stories from there? Would that be, I suppose, a respectful way to do that, to see who would like to speak about their story?
I think just talk to CLP or Wild or anybody that has a disability, and talk to them and talk to their worker about it, and to see if they want to talk to the media or talk to somebody about it, and if they want to speak out to how it is for them and with a disability, because people with a disability have got just as much right to speak out about it as much as anybody else does. So,
Jenny, I wonder if this is a good time to bring you in as well from your perspective. Thank you so much, Mick. From the Sporting Wheelies Association and some of those different disabilities that you're representing, what are some of the issues that you see that are affecting the disability sector that could be the source of some stories for us, do you think?
Thanks, Nance. If I just explain quickly what my role is, so I actually work primarily with the community rather than directly with people with a disability, and my role is really about helping the community to understand the benefit for them in welcoming and embracing people with a disability into what they do, and in our forum it's sport and healthy activity. But I'd like to draw upon, to highlight one of the issues that I see, I'd like to draw upon some of the words of people earlier on. Brett Casey mentioned that people with a disability come from all walks of life. They have aspirations and goals for education, for employment, for their family and friends and relationships, for spending their leisure time, for spending their disposable income out in the community. Because we know that about people with a disability, what the community needs to understand is that they need to be ready for people with a disability who have all of those different goals to be coming to them in their businesses, in their volunteering time, in their clubs, in their social activities, in their friendships and relationships. One of the strong principles about the NDIS is that the community, we talked to earlier, I think it was Kevin who mentioned it takes a village to raise a child, and that people who are welcomed and embraced are actually, like Kurt, for example, are actually embraced from an early age. They're part of the community, and that's just part of what that community sees. I think the media has a real role here to play in helping the community to understand the importance of their attitude, their thinking and their behaviour towards people with a disability, so that we can actually realise this goal of inclusion and realise this goal that the NDIS is trying to achieve by helping people with a disability to get the right supports that they need to actually have real choices and real control over where they want to actually have their ordinary life. Okay, so I'll just refer back to a story that's been very powerful for me that's not from the sports sector. There's a lady, and I'll just tell you, her first name is Fran. She's quite a well-known personality in the disability sector, but she said something a long time ago when the Productivity Commission report that was the prelude to the NDIS came out back in 2009, I think it was. She was speaking on a panel similar to this, Fran is a lady who requires some support in her life to do things that we would consider part of our ordinary lives. One of those things is to cut her toenails. And she told me a story that was really powerful, and I'd like to share it with you. Because of the way that the service system was sorted, and Fran was a recipient of disability funded services, to actually get her toenails cut, Fran had to spend her disability services money with a disability service provider to get someone to come to her house to cut her toenails. And that cost her $45 an hour to have that done. Now, Fran's argument with the NDIS is that she will finally be able to make the choice to spend the money that she needs to spend to get her toenails cut, to go down to the local beauty salon and sit there like everyone else in her community and actually get her toenails cut and painted and filed and have a nice chat with the beautician at the same time like every other woman in her community. And that is the premise of the NDIS. And that is the opportunity that you have in the media to portray the real stories of the difference this will make to the lives of people with a disability.
Thank you. That is a very good point, Jenny. And I think linking, as you said, it's linking those topics. I mean, I'm amazed that I haven't heard some of those background stories about Kurt Fearnley. And as you illustrated, that's actually in many ways what's so important about his story. It's not just that he's an amazing athlete, it's what helped him get there, you know, and what is that needs to be told that we're not doing elsewhere, that's enabling people like him. Jeff, this might be a good time for you to come in from Inclusion Moves, from this very important sporting perspective from Wheelies. Can you tell us about what are some of the issues that you see that aren't being told or that could be told better?
Sure. Just to do the typical talent thing when you're talking to a journal, I'm going to completely ignore Nance's question and I'm going to talk about what I want to talk about.
It's the first thing they teach you in training, isn't it?
I'm actually going to go back and talk a little bit about Kurt that I didn't get a chance to talk about before. Obviously grew up with Kurt playing sport. I've roomed with Kurt in Sydney and I won a gold medal in Sydney. He won a silver medal. Let's not forget that.
That's right.
He's perhaps gone on to bigger and better things, but that's beside the point. It was talked about whether Kurt should be seen as a hero. To me, and this is where perspective comes into it, to me he's not. To me he's the guy that I grew up drinking with in our 20s. And he's going to love me for saying that, by the way. But I didn't realise until I had kids that they see him as a hero. I went down and I took the kids down to, I got 3 kids at home, took them down to watch Kurt when he was training up in Brisbane one time a couple of years ago. And they just wouldn't stop talking about him. And I'm thinking, but this is just this guy that I used to hang out with. And then, just to make it worse, my wife gets his book, reads his book overnight in one go, makes me feel like an absolute champion. So I say, and I tease Kurt a lot, but I say that to illustrate that it really is the perspective that you're looking at it that defines whether or not you see someone as a hero or not. To me, he's not, but to plenty of other people, he is, and he should well be. Now, as far as issues affecting the disability sector, I'm going to go a little bit broader than the disability sector and talk about a concept of whether a disabled life is seen as valued as an able-bodied life. Now, we'll all remember a month or so ago, or maybe 6 weeks ago now, the terrible tragedy with the Arianda. I can never say her name. My daughter gives me so much crap. Ariana Grande. Ariana Grande. Yeah. Concert where there was a number of tragic deaths as a result of terrorism. Now, think of the publicity that tragedy, and my daughter has tickets, so I'm not trying to has tickets for the Brisbane concert, so I'm not trying to minimise that. The impact of those deaths whatsoever. But think about the number of media articles that were written about that, and then think there was actually a story back in late 2016, in August 2016, where over in Japan there was a congregate, and I'm going to use the term congregate living facility, otherwise known as an institution, where a number of people with disability were living. A former staff member of that institution murdered 19 of those people with a disability. just straight out decided that their life was not as valuable as able-bodied lives. He decided of his own intent that, you know what, people, society, and the people and the families and friends of these people would be better off without them. And that story hardly ever rated a mention in the media. So when we talk about reporting authentically of people with disability and their stories, how can we do that if we're not reporting on those big picture stories that actually define, are we taking people with disability and their lives as serious as an able-bodied person?
And I think that brings us to how to do the interviews for these subjects very well. Thank you, Jeff. Leanne, it's good to have a journo here with us. Thank you. We had an interesting question from one of the students before. I'm not sure if you heard it, about how to get these stories over the line with editors who may not be really open-minded, perhaps, about some of these issues. And I just, because you've done some incredible work in this area, I wonder if you could give us a bit of perspective on that, as well as how you've approached that story when you get an idea, perhaps, and how to approach interviews. Yep.
I've been a journalist for 20 odd years now, and I still don't know how to get a story past an editor if they're not interested. So that's the bad news. The good news is a good story is a good story is a good story. So it doesn't matter who's pitching it up, or if your story's good, it will stand up. You might just have to argue a bit harder or do a bit more research to show why it's relevant to your readership, why it's relevant to events of the day, why it's relevant to your sector or the message you're trying to get across. And if you don't work it first time, then you just put it away and do whatever other thing they want you to do, and then you bring it back another time where it might be, something might happen in the news where it's more relevant, or a good story is always a good story. It just might not be always the right time to tell that story.
I think of one of the stories that I just loved of yours recently with the elephant whisperer, yeah?
Oh, yeah.
And I think that brings up some interesting issues, and we will try and bring that up as a link. We do. We have it. Fabulous. Faith's going to bring that up. Because it is an amazing story. What are some of the practicalities of doing that, though, Leanne, when you're thinking through that? And how do I fairly represent this person who doesn't speak very well or clearly? How do you negotiate those boundaries? How do you do that?
So I guess the elephant whisperer, Alex Prokopis, came about because I'd been, his father, Brian Prokopis, has long worked in the community development sector. I've done stories with him in the past. So I guess that illustrates the value of a contact. That's just somebody I'd always worked with. I guess with telling Alex's story, I had the luxury with time with that, so I spent a lot of time with Alex and his dad. I spent a lot of time. I went to the drumming workshops that he attended, probably 2 or 3 times. I spent an hour or so interviewing Brian. I guess I prepared a few points for this, and I guess that's one thing that. There's a lot of, uniform ways or uniform things to think about, no matter who you're interviewing about what or where. There's a couple of uniform principles, but I guess with people with disabilities or people who live in a situation that's outside what we might consider normal, you've got to talk directly to the person who has the information you want. So I spoke. Well, it was difficult with Alex to speak directly to him, but I engaged with him and I participated, if you like, with him. So that's a point I'd always like you to remember. If you're interviewing somebody who's living with a disability or living in a situation that's considered outside the mainstream norm, they're the ones who can best tell you what that's like or best answer your questions. You might need a carer or a guardian or a parent or a translator or somebody to help you understand what the point or what that person is physically saying to you. But still, you've got to address them. You look at them. They're the ones who are living that life. They're the ones who know absolutely what that life is about. So with Alex, I spoke to his dad, obviously, but I interacted with Alex. So I guess that's a big point I wanted to get across. So I guess in terms of differences, the only thing was that took me a lot more time than it would, and time's a luxury that you don't always have in journalism.
But if students can do that, I think it shows that they should take a bit more time with some of these tricky topics. You're not going to get this done in an interview or in an afternoon.
Time is something you have to take all the time to do the research, time to know who you're talking to, time to research the issues. The more you know about the person you're interviewing and the issue you're interviewing them about beforehand, the better your questions will be, the better your rapport will be with the person, because you've shown them the respect to research the issue, to know as much as you can about the issue before you get their point of view. And it shows that you've, it basically comes down to respect. You come off as, it's far more professional and in your own, to yourself, but also to the person and the issue that you're writing about, is to take that time as much as you can to do that research, and then take that time to spend with them to make sure that you fully understand the message they want to get across, the life they live, the issues they want to raise.
Leona, I think perhaps that's a good time that you could add to this, and with Wild and the work that you're doing with people with an intellectual disability and media coverage, has that been a difficulty, I suppose, having people with that particular intellectual disability, that type of disability, to be heard and to be treated properly in the media? What are some tips you have?
Some tips would be, I think, just having from an understanding of around intellectual and cognitive disabilities. There are just some really things that are very common amongst a lot of people. So difficulty with abstract concepts, so being really concrete in the words that you and the phrases that you use. And if you're building rapport well, you will hopefully make it okay for someone to ask you if they don't understand what you're asking. The second thing is that something that's really common is that because of people's experiences, some people won't identify as having an intellectual disability, or might not choose to identify with whatever their disability is. So that can lead to what we call masking, which can be that someone will go to great lengths to cover up their disability and might have learned some really excellent skills over many years around how to get by, how to pass, and because that can afford people assistance, protection, it can not make me stand out and be a target of violence or bullying or all those sorts of things. So there's real practical reasons why people develop these skills. And I would look out for what we would call acquiescence, so just agreeing generally with whatever you ask or say, either because I'm not entirely sure what you're asking, or perhaps because I am, you appear to be in a position of authority and it's probably the safest thing just to go along, because again, a life of possibly being subjected to violence and people abusing their power, people will sometimes learn the skill to go along, find the easiest path of least resistance to kind of navigate a situation without, exposing themselves too greatly. So I guess to develop then the skills of self-advocacy, to be able to talk to your issues, the people like from Hot Topics and Community Living Association and Wild, it can take quite some time to develop those skills, to be the person to talk about the issues that are important to you. Some people, like the general community, there are people who it comes to very naturally as well. But allowing people, you can't underestimate, being allowed to offer people more time, because you will get better information and more authentic engagement from that.
And I think of your website actually as part of that. We'll have to try and put that on our list of resources. Wild has a great website that is both in, what would you say?
Well, we've actually just redone it recently. So we used to have it in a sort of what we called a plain English
Yes.
and an easy English section, but now we've sort of redone it to just try and do as much of it all in plain English
easy
as
English.
possible. And that's not, writing easy English is not an easy thing to do, and there's no perfect science to it either, but it usually, at the very least, being aware of when you're using language that's inaccessible is a really good place to start, like just hearing yourself doing it and going, okay, I need to try that again. And then in terms of that respectful practice, then owning that. Oh, I did, and as I had a lovely example before of somebody doing that, going, I think I said that wrong. Can I give another go at putting that in a way that might make some more sense, and kind of owning it when.
So that would be a good technique in an interview if you can feel that's happened, and to just sort of to own
listen
that.
to yourself. And you know, for those of us who've been sort of working in this area for a long time, we're not perfect at it. You can hear yourself doing it. And it's half the trick is hearing it and going, okay, I'm going to give that another go. And finding a way to use more concrete language. Anything that's abstract is anything you can't feel, touch, hold, see with your eyes. So a lot of the issues that we've talked about today, like big disability insurance schemes, like justice, like mental health, these are all abstract concepts that
You've got to really think of how to break that down.
Can be really useful if you're trying to communicate someone to really, or asking them to put those things in their own words if you're wanting to check understanding. So I've asked this, what does that mean to you? Can you tell me what we've just talked about, and sort of getting someone to kind of talk back to you about what their understanding is of the interaction that you've had can be enlightening and if a person can't tell you, then you might need to give it another go.
Keeping questions simple, which is a good interviewing technique always. Try and avoid the double banger, endless questions. Just keep it very to the point.
The only thing just quickly add to that, I think, is it would be really useful, I think, just to do some real crash course on myths and common myths and stereotypes, and just the language to really steer away from. There's some really horrible language that can still float around, but I guess related to that as well, there's this there's kind of almost two conversations around language happening at the moment, which I guess speaks back to asking the individual how they would like to be described or how they would describe themselves. But you've got the person first stuff, where it's the person with a disability, and then there's another school of thought that's coming out at the moment that says, no, I'm a disabled person because of this society that is disabling me. It's that my disability is not an inherent part of it. And there's conversations that go on about that, and there's again, which probably speaks back to the Not Speaking with One Voice panel that happened a little bit earlier, but asking the person how they would like to be described is also a respectful practice.
And just finally, I think too, when I've worked with you to do interviews before, the issue of permissions is always an interesting one to negotiate. Would you advise always, when interviewing someone with an intellectual disability, it's good to have an advocate that they know or is it just not a simple yes and no kind of answer? How do you advise that?
Yeah, it's not a simple yes and no, but I think if the person's invited to have somebody who they feel comfortable with, then that can be a way for somebody to be supported, and really keeping your mind to any unintended consequences that you don't want to increase the risk, that's particularly if somebody's talking about issues related to violence, particularly where they're currently living, or a justice issue that they might be caught up in. You'd really hate to increase that person's risk by accidentally talking about things that might increase their risk. But again, balancing that with giving people an opportunity to talk out about horrible things that are ethics.
Yes, that's right. I think I did find it helpful when you were there, though, to help with those decisions, even about if you can't identify someone because it's a legal issue, talking to the interviewee, to the person about, do you want to use a different name? Do you want to not have any name? Or how would you like to handle that? And you could explain that sometimes a bit better than perhaps
I guess I'd add to that then, part of that thinking through unintended consequences is helping somebody think through, okay, so if we use your name and somebody hears that on the radio, they might go, oh, I know Sally, that's, and that might be your family who hears that. Are you okay with that? That might be your, the service provider might hear that. Is that going to be okay? What would happen, do you think, if they heard it? So taking it that step further around the concept of informed consent is, really helping people understand exactly what it is that they're agreeing to. And just really quickly, an example of that might be if with images that we might have on our website, we'll say to so Wild is funded to provide sexual assault counselling for people with an intellectual disability, and we'll say, but also broad victim of crime services. If we put this photo up of you, or if we include it in our annual report, some people know that Wild helps people who have been raped. that may or may not have happened to you, but but some people might see you and might think that that's happened to you. Is that okay? Are you comfortable with that? So really kind of taking it that step further to help tease out what the consequences might be.
John, coming to you again as a journalist, so coming from that perspective of, from your perspective, perhaps different to intellectual disability, what are some of those issues of how to really approach interviewing, how to do this respectfully and get the best story for the issues that you'd like to see covered, do you think?
I thoroughly agree with the majority of what you were just saying in terms of respect, but also in being professional and showing that respect. It is doing your homework on the person that you're interviewing prior, so that you get to understand. You might find out beforehand what are some ways in which I can communicate that might be most effective in establishing rapport, in framing my questions. And again, like you were saying, if that doesn't go quite according to plan, having the ability, the confidence, and just the responsibility, I guess, to reframe that and to find another line of questioning or another way of delivering a question that person can respond to in the way that you're looking for, but also in the way that is conducive to the way that they communicate. I think that's the key. I think vulnerability is a really significant issue, and as much as it's important to be objective, and when there's an issue that may not be, may not be particularly positive, but at the same time recognise that there is a human being that you're addressing here, and just to be very mindful of that person's vulnerability is something that's really important.
And just on practicalities too, John, for a person in a wheelchair as yourself, I think I was talking with you before, some of the language around being bound to a wheelchair and all that kind of thing.
Wheelchair band and all that sort of stuff. Yeah. For me, it's not just an issue of semantics. Like some people would say, oh yes, it's just semantics. But for me personally, a set of stairs is my handicap. But I'm not handicapped. I have a disability. And I still hear that in the media sometimes, and I still see that in parking signs where it'd be handicap zone. And I'm like, is there something wrong with the parking space? So... And
you're not bound to your wheelchair. Your wheelchair's your freedom, basically.
No, it is very much my freedom, absolutely. It's... So when you're interviewing a person with a disability, not necessarily having the assumption that disability is holding them back, is a barrier to them, is something that is a cause of suffering, and that's part of being a journalist when you're talking to anybody, is actually understanding what any human being's experience is, and not making assumptions about what you think their experience might be, and kind of leading with that assumption. So not seeing a person as your agenda, or what you think you want to portray from the outset of an article, but actually being prepared to really authentically engage and develop that rapport, take that time, be very patient in reframing your questions if need be, to really understand and to really listen to how that person experiences their disability, as opposed to the way that you think they may be challenged, or they may experience barriers, or maybe suffering, or those cliches or stereotypes that you often see misrepresented quite a lot in the media.
So as a student journalist, would it be okay for me to ring you up in a practical sense and go, where is the best place to do an interview that is accessible for you? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I think sometimes students perhaps are a little bit nervous. They don't want to offend. So is it just best to be upfront and go, look, where, you know, is that your house or is there a cafe that
Yeah.
you live near that you feel comfortable in that is not a problem for you to get to?
I think that the issue of being scared of offending people is something that, as a journalist, you need to not have, regardless of the person that you're talking about, really, or talking to. Really, is because you want to actually engage with them and help them to feel comfortable with you in the first place, regardless of who it is. A person with a disability, Ando does it beautifully, you know, in the way that Andrew Denton did it beautifully, in the way he talked to everyday people with disabilities or any walk of life. And he would just have this intuitive, but I suspect it's not just intuitive. I think he did his homework and really understood that person before he went in and actually started speaking to them at all about what conditions they would like to speak under, what are some of the issues, what are some of the communication styles that would need to be addressed for this person. So I think, it sometimes doesn't serve the person with a disability or yourself to be too scared of offending, because how else are you going to establish a rapport with somebody if you don't ask them the question, you know? Put it in a really simple term, you know, if you want to go up and ask a woman out and you're too afraid to do that, well then, you know, how are you going to have a relationship?
It's true. Same thing. Yes, Jeff. Yep.
Context, put a little bit of a different context on things. Both in my sporting career and in my professional career in the disability sector, I've actually been, the articles that have been written about me and that I've had a part in, the articles that I've received, that I've seen as the best ones, have been the ones that don't actually mention my disability whatsoever. In my sporting career, I would have been cranky with the journo beyond belief if my disability took up any more than 1 or 2 lines of the article. If it was about me breaking a world record or winning a particular event, it shouldn't take up any more than 1 or 2 lines. And the same in my disability career. I work a lot currently in government relations. So I can be advocating or in an activist role or a political lobbying role against Queensland Government, and I can be speaking on behalf of a group of people with a disability. Now, my disability in that is actually irrelevant. Now, I'm speaking on behalf of a group of diverse people with diverse disabilities, from intellectual impairment to physical disability, to deaf, to hard of hearing, to vision impaired, to blind, and everything in between. But if the journo ever writes about my disability, my God, they're going to get a phone call the next day, because that's not the context that they should be looking at the conversation. I'm there as a professional, the same as any other political lobbyist would be, to speak about an issue. If Adani happened to have a political liaison officer that had a disability, you wouldn't report on their disability. You'd report on whatever they're saying about Adani at the time. But I sometimes still need to remind a journo that the conversation I'm having with you isn't actually about me, it's about other people.
So context is everything.
Yes.
Now, I've seen some hands going up, which is great. So we might go to some questions from our students to our fantastic panel. Faith, you've got is this the mic here? Yeah. Okay. Well, where was that hand that went up a little while ago? Sorry, I thought we will come back to you.
Hi, I'm Madeline McCosker from Griffith. I'm a journalism student. Someone mentioned earlier about somewhere you can go to find the language that is appropriate when writing stories. Is there somewhere in particular to find that information, or is it just, you know, you just talk to the people themselves and see what they prefer?
are resources available, like Away with Words is something that the Department of Communities from Queensland has produced a long time ago. But that is couched in that first person terminology, that person with a disability language. And as we've talked about, that language is popular amongst a certain group of people with disability. I myself kind of sit halfway in between, which is really annoying to people. It kind of seems to be one of those ones where you're supposed to pick your side, but to me, I haven't quite picked my side yet. And to me, that's okay. So it's always best to talk to the person themselves about how they'd normally refer to themselves.
And we are putting together a resource as part of this project, aren't we, Faith, on that very topic, Madeline? So if you see some good ones, keep them in mind, and let's figure out how to improve them as well. And get them. We want to try and get them out to a lot of different newsrooms and get everyone thinking about appropriate language. Okay, some other questions from our students?
Dan, could you pass that to Rowan for me? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rowan from Gold Coast. Rowan Cook from Gold Coast. I just want to ask a broad question to everybody on the panel here, because since panel 1 and panel 2, there's been a variety of requirements with respect to the word disability. We've had one person say, well, we don't want to be called disabled, we want to be called alternatively disabled or differently abled, I suppose, and differently abled is like everybody in this class. I think universities have a GPA, which shows how differently abled students are. So, I mean, when it comes to disability and that term disability and how we as journalists apply that term, can I maybe ask all of you in some sort of way, what is the definition of disabled?
I think the definition of disabled would be someone in a wheelchair, but that person, I don't think just because they're in a wheelchair means they're disabled. I think they just got a disability, and they're proud of it. You know, they're going on with their lives. They're doing whatever they want. They don't want to be judged as with a person with saying, "Oh, you're in a wheelchair and you should be. You're disabled. You can't do nothing. You're hopeless. You're no good. You can't do anything." That's just rubbish. People in a wheelchair can just do just as much as anybody else can. They can work, they can cook for themselves, they can basically do it, they can do their everyday life just as much as anyone else can.
Yes, Faith, yep. Oh, okay. Sorry, yep.
Hello,
Mr.
sorry,
Simon?
I'm Jeremy.
Yep.
I work here at Griffith University. I'm one of the Disability Services Officers. So just in relation to language and terminology, there's a long history on language and terminology about the way people with disabilities want to be referred to and how they're referred to. And if you really want to know, look back at the language and where it's come from. It's way different to what it was 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years and 40 years ago. And it's actually driven by people with disabilities themselves. And it's changed over time. So we refer to ourselves as people with disabilities in certain contexts, in certain environments where we believe that is the most appropriate type of language to use. In other environments, we might refer to ourselves as whatever we want to, depending on who's listening to and who's going to use that in that context. In the UK, the disability community over there refer to themselves as disabled because we're disabled and we're here and we're proud and we're not going anywhere. In Australia, we haven't quite got to that yet because we don't believe the able-bodied community is ready for that.
You're discriminating against me.
Yeah. So just saying that when you're looking at language and terminology, look at the history of it and look at why first person is used and then why it may not be used and then why people are using it themselves. Well, the definition of disabled comes from the social, the social model around my impairment is my spinal cord injury. I use a wheelchair to assist me with that, but my handicap is society.
Mm-hmm.
Technically, there are definitions of disability that cover, but basically, whether you look at international, national, state legislation, human rights stuff, it very much talks about a person that has a physical, sensory, social, psychosocial and I'm sure there's something I've forgotten that someone's going to tell me about.
Psychiatric.
But that impairment that significantly impacts upon their functional abilities to undertake a range of things. And those range of things are defined generally as being able to, around the areas of their own personal care, which includes anything from getting out of bed to actually eat, getting a meal, dressing, etc., to getting out and about and participating in the community. Because some of those things that people have significant impairment are around the issues of communication and thinking through how you're going to do things, as I think Simon and a number of people on the panel have said. But that's basically the definition. And if you're asking like how you, why people are so sensitive about the language, well, it's about how it really comes back to the treatment of people with disability over the last 200 years ago. People in this room may not be aware, but in the Middle Ages, people with disabilities were actually put on boats and set to sea and never allowed to land in many ports. It was a way to get rid of them, to make them die out easily. People were then circus freaks. That's where the circus freaks came from. They were people that were different, and that was a way of displaying people, let alone a number of other stories that we could tell you about the history of disability as it's transpired. I grew up in a state, I have a sister with an intellectual and so-called psychosocial disability. She has schizophrenia. When we were kids growing up, you could actually, it was that the mental health legislation in this state was such that she was held for a long period of time without any kind of a legislative detainment or any base for that, because if you were bad and mad in those days, you got sent to places like Wilston Park where you lived for the rest of your life. So that's why there's a lot of sensitivity around the word of disability.
Simon, did you have, sorry, you wanted to add to that before, or I think?
Oh, no, not really. You know what though? One of my majors is intellectual disability studies, and I did my honours year in the Division of Disability Studies at RMIT, and I'm sitting here shaking my head, not really sure how to answer this question for you guys. Goodness help you.
Yes, yes, yeah.
The question, as a journalist, how do you refer to people who are living with a disability? It really comes down to context. Like the example that Brett from Deaf Queensland raised before, a 38-year-old man charged with murder. Doesn't matter if he's deaf or dumb, but if you're doing a story about the NDIS, you might want to say that such and such an advocate for an organisation, and in the next sentence, who has lived with a condition for a certain amount of time, because that gives it context. They know best about what that is going to be, what that sort of life is going to be about. And then you can get even into more specifics. Like I did a story about people who in Queensland living with dwarfism. So I guess, and that's a point I wanted to, that you be specific. So I'm just trying to remember the name of the people, and they each had a different...
Kobe and Grant.
Yeah, Kobe had a specific type of dwarfism, so I named the type she had. And then Grant, another man I interviewed, he had a different type. So you'd be as specific as you can. It's not about a disability so much as a medical condition that they live with, and it allows them to do this, but it doesn't impact on anything else. So it's about the context of the story you're writing, why you're writing the story, what's the point of the story, what message are you or the talent trying to get across. So in terms of a definition of disability in a journalistic context, how long's a piece of string? It really depends on the story you're telling and how relevant it is to the story you're telling. Like with the story about Alex, the elephant whisperer, I didn't say he had a disability. I said that he lived with autism and Asperger's and Down syndrome. Be specific. It's not about, you use terms like people living with a disability for like really broad issues where it might be about NDIS or something. I'm happy to be corrected on that too. And also your journalistic, so your organisation that you work for, they will generally have a style guide as well. Most often, which is put together in consultation with specific sectors of the community. So how we talk about mental illness, the language we use, we have a style guide that's dictated or advised, comes under advisement by the people who work in that sector, same with disabilities or those sort of things. But I guess in bringing back to a point that's raised earlier, never assume, and don't be afraid to ask stupid questions, because there's no such thing as a stupid question. If you're in a crowded room and there's a person you want to talk to who's sitting in a wheelchair, like I've done this, are you happy for me to stand, or would you like me to kneel down while I'm talking to you? So you're on a face-to-face level. Same with Kobe. She is smaller in stature than a prep student. So I said to her, how do you want to do this? I met her in her home, we sat at the kitchen table. Let them tell you, they've agreed to the interview, they want to educate you, they want to educate the wider community. Be educated, don't be afraid to ask stupid questions or what feels like a stupid question. And make yourself vulnerable, because that builds a rapport, that shows how willing you are to learn about what they want to tell you, or what message they want to get across, or the life they lead, the realities of the life they lead. And I guess that's the same with anybody, because it's not just people with disabilities who want to teach you about the life they lead. It could be, it can be anyone living a life different to what you've experienced. And basically that's what journalism is. You're learning about lives different to the one you're experiencing them, and you're putting that message or putting that story out into the world so that your readers or viewers or bloggers or whoever's looking at your content is in turn learning about a life different to the one they're living. So, that's fundamentally it. And if you make yourself vulnerable, you're building a rapport, you're showing respect, you're showing your openness and willingness to learn.
Oh, it's wonderful getting a perspective from both sides of the fence, I think. Thank you, Kiralee.
Sorry. Just one of the things that I've found useful to think about when you're trying to conceptualise this.
And Kiralee is
a corporate affairs manager from Endeavour Foundation, but a former journalist. But I've been working in the disability sector for about 12 years or something. I think it's useful to talk about disability if you're examining the ways that society or government or whatever is not doing what they need to do to address people's needs. But in other contexts, it's really helpful to think about diversity. Just as, there's all kinds of diversity in the world, and often disability is about genetic diversity. And that takes away whether people are valued or not, they're just different.
Yes, Faith.
I have a question for you, Leanne, and then I'll open it up to you and Nance. Do you have a family member, or do you yourself identify as having a lived experience with disability, or do you come to the sector without any kind of attachment?
I haven't thought about it like that before, but I do have, I grew up in Rockhampton, and I have a cousin who lives with a disability. Both intellectual and physical. I can't tell you what it is. I don't remember the details of it. But and he would attend horse riding for the disabled every Sunday, and I became a volunteer there, and so I would go and work, volunteer, help the clients, the people with their riding, teaching them, helping them, supporting them while they're on the horse, that sort of thing. And one of the people I met there was Carney Liddell, and she was, if you don't know Carney, she's a very famous Paralympian advocate for people with disabilities, and she has, spinal atrophy she has. Sorry, I get that wrong. But there's a really good TED talk she gave, and I was going to try and raise it today, based on something Jeff said earlier. Carney Liddell spoke at TEDx Brisbane, go and Google it, and she spoke about this idea that whether a life with a disability is less than, and she talked about it in the sense of, when women are pregnant, everyone says, what are you going to have, is it a boy or girl? And the parents-to-be will say, we don't care as long as it's healthy. And by the, normal definition, Carney was born an unhealthy child. even though she's gone on to live a very successful life in both sporting, corporate, public speaking, education, any facet of life. She has just had her own child. But she wants everyone, she did this great talk about how getting people to reframe the question. So what are you having, a boy or girl? I don't care as long as the baby's happy. So having a happy child as opposed to a healthy child, because a healthy child, you know, that is so subjective to what health is. You know, her heart beats fine, her brain works fine, her lungs work fine. It's just her spine that doesn't work as well as somebody else's. So I think I've gone off track, but certainly go and listen to Carney's TEDx, and I did a story about it, and then Frances Whiting did a story just recently in Q Weekend about Carney raising a boy, her son, on her own. She's a single mother. She never thought she'd be able to have children.
The reason I asked the question is I'm familiar with Nancy's background, and I understand that informs Nance's inclusive and I guess supportive way of reporting around these issues. And I was just wondering, coming from your background, do you have that kind of training or awareness within your newsroom? Is that something that newsrooms should be incorporating? Because someone like, for me, example, who doesn't have any exposure or awareness, how do you bring that to your reporting if you don't have that exposure?
I guess every journalist will have their own lived experience of something. Nobody's going to have lived experience of disability or mental health illness. I guess I've got that very small and very, I guess, distant lived experience of disability. I've written extensively about mental health because I have a lived experience of mental health. I've written extensively about postnatal depression because I have a lived experience of postnatal depression. I had that with my second son. I was hospitalised for 6 weeks. I've lost a friend to postnatal depression, so that's a very big, passionate area for me. But I think as a journalist, the one thing you've got to learn is empathy. You've got to have respect for other people, have some semblance of empathy. You don't know what it's like. It's that whole thing of walk a mile in another man's shoes. You know, you've got to. The way to best get stories or get the best stories and build connections with people is have that empathy, respect, show them dignity, be professional in your own way, and you know, people will, that's how the stories come back, because people like to deal with you. They know you're going to treat them and their story or whatever they're bringing to you with respect and dignity.
So yes, just briefly, yes, I do have an intellectually disabled brother. And, you know, he has been a massive influence on my life and probably a massive influence on this project. But I wouldn't say that necessarily makes me the best person to always do these stories. It's not that simple, and I find it interesting, even with this, the story that I won a Walkley for on the case of the 7 intellectually disabled children who were sexually abused. It was so traumatic and difficult to do. And in many ways, I think having the lived experience almost made that harder. I know my mum raised concerns with me about whether I'd be able to cope and all that kind of thing. So don't think it's a bad thing if you don't know anyone with a disability, because you know, shows you're open-minded and a better journo, I think, to go into it fresh.
I concur with that it can be a detriment to have a lived experience because you've got a whole lot of emotional baggage and whatever tied up in it, so you can be second guessing yourself as whether you're agenda-free. Am I biased in pitching this story? Is it because of my own stuff that I'm pitching this? You know, so I fully agree with what Nancy said. You know, just because you don't know or haven't lived that life doesn't mean you can't tell that story just as well as anybody else.
Can I just say that is it on? No?
Yep.
So yeah, I agree that if your skill in listening allows you to communicate well with a person who's got a very different experience to you, then that's great. But a part of journalism, as far as I understand it, is sort of an element of studying society and people. So if you don't know an experience of humanity, then it might be good to find a way to get some experience. You know, so there's ways to get to know people who live different lives. Someone here is doing sociology with journalism. I think that's a great partnership. You know, to study society. look up the word sociological imagination. I think it's probably, a lot of you know it, but it's something that a lot of people don't know about, and it's a good term to incorporate in how you're educatively doing your work.
I think that brings us to the end of this amazing Project Open Space launch today, and I want to thank you all for taking part. Thank you so much for our panel and for our speakers who, thank you for contributing from the floor, because everyone's perspective was really valuable. Thank you so much to everybody. I have brought up some of those stories that I referred to. The Elephant Whisperer is here. I've got a mouse that is not cooperating, but I will kind of move through those and you can have a look through them at your leisure. And I think Faith has emailed you the links as well. And we'll see you next week with your story ideas. Looking forward to it.